When I was younger, my parents tried their best to keep me away from the internet. They saw it as a dangerous place, full of negativity, and they ignored the potential it had. But, like everything else, they couldn't hold out forever. Eventually, the internet became more accessible and they finally caved. We got a family computer. It wasn't much, nothing fancy, but what it contained felt like the start of something new, something bigger than we could fully grasp. Every day after school, I'd rush home, eager to get online. I'd devour whatever articles I could find, peeking into people's lives through personal blogs, and I'd spend hours playing games made by strangers. There were so many things to discover, even though my parents had installed filters to try to limit what I could see. I was just 12, after all. But I wasn't too concerned with what they were trying to protect me from. It wasn't like I was looking for anything too dangerous. It wasn't long before I began to stumble across stories that seemed different, stories I couldn't easily categorize. Some of them were clearly fictional, over-the-top tales of killers and bizarre monsters. But there was one story that stuck with me, one that felt like it might have a kernel of truth buried within it. It was called the Russian sleep experiment. The story described a gruesome experiment conducted by Russian researchers on prisoners of war. They were promised their freedom if they agreed to sit in a chamber where a gas would suppress their need for sleep. But, as you can guess, things didn't go as planned. The prisoners began to mentally unravel. They deteriorated, their bodies and minds breaking down. And yet, they didn't die. They lingered on, mutilated, with their intestines hanging out, but still somehow alive. It wasn't just that they were alive, though. These broken shells of humanity had gained strength. The only thing they wanted was to go back into the chamber, to be put under the gas again. The ending, well, it was the stuff of nightmares. One of the surviving generals ordered the last living prisoner to be put back into the chamber. But as a scientist tried to intervene, the prisoner, if you could still call him that, revealed something horrifying. He said that this creature, this monstrosity, was what lurked inside all of us. It was the hidden demon we suppress with sleep. I remember sitting there, frozen, staring at the screen after reading it. My mind raced. Was this real? Who wrote this? Could it even be possible? Questions spun in my head for days after. And as much as I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsettlingly true about it. I'd seen strange, leaked documents from wartime experiments, bizarre ideas from the era. But this story, this Russian sleep experiment, it felt different. It felt real. Over the years, my fascination with psychological experiments never faded. I found myself drawn to the darker side of human behavior. I'd read about the Stanford prison experiment, where students were assigned to be either guards or prisoners, and the whole thing spiraled into chaos, brutality, and power struggles. It was a horrifying reminder of how easily we can slip into cruelty under the right circumstances. But the Russian sleep experiment, that story stayed with me, haunting me in ways I couldn't explain. Something about it kept me coming back. And as I grew older, I couldn't help but wonder, what if, somehow, there was a truth behind it all? I've always had a fascination with the Milgram experiment. It's one of those studies that leaves you disturbed, but also strangely captivated by what it reveals about human nature. Paid volunteers were told they were part of a memory test. One person would be the teacher, the other the learner. The teacher controlled an electric shock machine, and every time the learner answered a question wrong, they were to administer a shock. The thing was, they were warned about the learner's heart condition, and each time the shock was wrong, the voltage would increase by 15 volts. The learner, who was actually an actor, would scream in pain, bang on the walls, and beg them to stop. But the scientist in the room, calm and authoritative, would simply tell them to continue. Eventually, the teacher would administer what could easily be a fatal shock, even though they could hear the learner's desperate cries. The craziest part was that most of these teachers, 65% of them, in fact, continued past the 450-volt mark, well beyond what a human being could physically survive. They showed clear signs of distress, some even offering to stop and leave, but still, they followed the instructions. This test, it shattered what most psychologists believed about human obedience. They thought people would stop at the threshold, but they didn't. And while the experiment didn't result in anyone actually dying, it gave a terrifying insight into how much power authority figures can have over people. Some even compared the results to the atrocities of the Holocaust, how, in the face of authority, humans could so easily become complicit in evil. Psychology has changed since then. Ethics standards have become stricter, and most experiments now are so watered down that they barely scratch the surface of what we could understand about the human mind. We can't do the same kinds of tests anymore, and I hate it. I hate that there's so much potential we're not tapping into. I've had ideas, dark, intriguing ones, that could push us to the edge of human understanding. But every time I try to pitch something, it's shut down by legalities and ethics codes. I worked my way up in the counseling field, became a private counselor, and started making decent money. It wasn't my passion, but it paid the bills, at least for a while. And it gave me the chance to save up for something more ambitious. I had this idea, this drive, to replicate the Russian sleep experiment. The premise was simple: deprive someone of sleep for an extended period. No sleep, no rest, just the slow degradation of the human mind and body. There are many ways to prevent sleep: caffeine, fear, pain, and I started planning. I saved up enough to convert my basement into the perfect room for the experiment. It was detached from the main house, and the neighbors were far enough away that I wouldn't be disturbed. I had a soundproofed room built, and I padded the walls. It felt like the perfect setup. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore, one flaw that had haunted me from the beginning. How would I get the right kind of subjects? The original researchers had to monitor their subjects through a small portal window, but I had a much more advanced setup. I could track everything with high-definition cameras, and the best part? It wasn't nearly as expensive as it would have been years ago. The room was nearly perfect. I had a reinforced door to make sure no one could escape. Everything was under my control, every move watched from the safety of my monitors. Now, I just needed a subject. No one would volunteer for something like this, not willingly. And I couldn't go through any official channels, so I had to be resourceful. It didn't take long for me to find the perfect candidate. His name was Josh Kent, a man I'd been counseling for weeks. Josh had been struggling with the grief of losing his mother and wife in the same month. He didn't have any family left. He was isolated. Alone. A perfect target. At first, he seemed to have a few strange problems. He complained about hearing voices and feeling urges he couldn't control. But, as far as I could tell, there was nothing wrong with him beyond the normal reaction to grief. He just needed someone to talk to. And I was happy to fill that role. He paid for our sessions with the hefty inheritance money he'd received, and he came to me regularly, spilling out his loneliness and his confusion. I began to see him less as a patient and more as a means to an end. He was alone, a person with no close ties. He was disposable. To society, at least. In some twisted way, I even convinced myself I was doing the world a favor by using him. It didn't take long before Josh scheduled another appointment. His life had been a constant echo of loss, and now, it was time for him to play a role in mine. When he arrived for our usual session, I could tell he was still grappling with the loneliness that consumed him. We talked, just like before. But this time, there was something different. As he relaxed, I moved behind him, slipping a syringe from the sleeve of my jacket. I pressed the needle into his neck, and within seconds, he dropped. Just like that, I had him. No one would notice. No one would care. I transported him to my house, keeping him unconscious. When I dressed him in a clean set of white clothing, I couldn't help but think that this might be the last sleep he would ever experience. As I strapped him down, I ensured he couldn't escape. I didn't have the exact gas the original experiment used, there was no record of it, but I knew enough. I injected him with the right chemicals, pumped adrenaline into his system, and made sure his food and water were laced with enough caffeine to keep him awake. If he tried to force himself to sleep, I had the perfect solution, a remote control that would shock him back to consciousness. Once everything was in place, I waited. Eventually, Josh woke. His eyes darted around, confused and frightened. I pressed the button linked to the intercom and spoke calmly, almost reassuringly. "Welcome, Josh. I'm sure you're confused, but don't worry. You're here for a reason. You've always spoken about the voices and urges that scare you. Well, I'm about to perform a great experiment to fix that. Don't be frightened. Everything is happening for a reason. Trust me." I could see the panic spread across his face, fear, then regret. I knew he must have been fighting a storm of thoughts, but he would never get the chance to voice them. I explained to him what was going to happen. I told him I was going to help him, to reset his brain. And to do that, I needed to prevent him from sleeping for 30 days. But 30 days wasn't my real goal. No, my goal was to